Welcome back to this week's edition of Modern Tech and Transformation. I'm Carla Hartman, and with me is my co-host, Michael Brown. Happy to have him back. And this week, we are going to talk about assessing the maturity of your digital transformation at your organization. So welcome back, Michael. Happy to have you.
Thanks. Glad to be here.
And I know you've done digital maturity assessments at organizations. Tell us a little bit about, let's start with what a very mature company looks like when it comes to digital transformation.
Very mature, yeah. So first thing I'll say is, I struggle with the word maturity when we're talking about digital transformation because there's not a lot of maturity, right? It's not a dominant trait inside of organizations. So I like the word readiness, but it doesn't really, but DTMA or digital transformation maturity assessment really just rolls off the tongue. But when you think about the organizations in the world that really have, created a digital business, it's companies like Tesla, like Amazon, right? They really understand the importance of all of the data, and they're really working to and iteratively to make use of it, right? Mm-hmm. So if you think about the idea that digital transformation and AI and ML is kind of like a flywheel, right? It's really hard to get started. Then once it gets started, though, it's easy to keep adding energy to it and making it go faster and faster. And then once you reach a certain amount of momentum, then it starts producing, additional. It produces energy, right? And it feeds back into itself. And so if you just keep maintaining that flywheel, then it produces amazing results. And really, you look at companies like Amazon and Tesla, and they're doing that. And then you look at some of the more traditional organizations in the world, and they struggle with, just normal things, right?
And that's what I want to touch on next. So on one side of the spectrum, we have people that are doing it really well, organizations like Tesla and Amazon. What about the other side of the spectrum? The companies maybe not doing so well. What does a very immature company look like in regards to digital transformation?
Well, I think there's certain traits that you can look for, and you'll find in certain segments of industry that those companies have these traits. And it's really companies that, they think that they're doing something simplistic, or they think they're doing something simple, and they don't know that there's value in the data. We see that trait sometimes in the manufacturing and in the industrial industries. There's a lot of opportunity to digitally transform and start getting telemetry and data about those machines. A lot of times, organizations they think they're gathering data, but the data just goes into this one silo, and it's not being used as effectively as it could. That's another great opportunity for digital transformation. And one of the things that we do when we do a digital transformation maturity assessment or readiness assessment is we look for those investments that companies have made inside of the organization, right? We look for the people that are embracing that, right? So it's about it's the normal stuff, right? The people, the process, and the technology, right? You have to look at all three of those, and all three of those have to know, right? Have to absolutely know what is the digital transformation strategy. What is your strategy, right? You have to have a strategy. And all three of those have to be aligned to that strategy. And then you also have to have the infrastructure and architecture to support that strategy, right? If you don't have that, then there's a misalignment, right? You've got huge gaps, and you're going to run into failure. You're going to run into POC, stagnation. And then finally, something that comes out of setting the strategy and putting in the infrastructure is you end up with a list of standards, right? I'm not going to let closed systems into my ecosystem. So you come up with a minimum set of technology standards, right? You have to have that in order to put a guardrail around your ecosystem. And so once you have a strategy, once you have the infrastructure and architecture, and then once you have the minimum standards around how you can operate, and the types of technology that you'll let in, then you can just go to work iterating, right? Okay. Grinding. Last thing I'll say, digital transformation is not a product. It is a strategy, and there's no magic. There's not something that just, we did it. It is something that you wake up every day and you go and do. right? And then you do the next thing, and then you do the next thing, because you're adding energy to that flywheel, right? That's it. That's all you're doing. And then eventually it starts producing like really outlandish results. But in the beginning it was just, really arduous.
Yeah, no, that's really good stuff. So interesting to hear what you need to have in place. And if you don't have in place, you're at one side of the spectrum. And then obviously we can ideate on,
Yeah.
and we know the companies that are doing it well. So when CFOs, even CEOs hear digital transformation, they think, what's this going to cost? Am I going to get ROI? What is the biggest technical debt you've seen from undergoing digital transformation?
Well, sometimes the biggest technical debt is nothing technical at all. It's actually the culture. The culture is the biggest technical debt, because if you think about organizations that where the culture is, you must be right. You can't make mistakes. We must eliminate risk at all times, right? And that's traditionally how we've run business, right? That's why you set your budgets a certain way. It's how you do your hiring plans a certain way. You set your capital plans a certain way. It's all about eliminating risk. And the reality is when you start doing digital transformation, especially when you start implementing machine learning and models to help rapidly transform your business, you end up in a situation to where you have to experiment. Experimentation becomes the prime driving mechanism for innovation, right? It's not, I'm going to do this and this will happen and my ROI is this. You have to experiment, because a lot of times you'll find that the data that you have in your ERP or in your MES or in some CRM system that you have is not exactly the data that you need for machine learning. Or the results that you get are inconclusive, and so, I need to add more features. And so you have to do this over and over again, and then when you get one good data set, it feeds downstream into the next thing that you do.
So we've talked about companies that are doing digital transformation really well, that are very mature, what it looks like to not be mature whatsoever, and what the biggest challenge is, which is culture. So how do we actually assess digital maturity?
It's fairly straightforward. We look at companies, and we want to look at across the company, right? We want to look at the culture and the people. We want to look at the technology, like what investments have already been made, what technologies already exist, that are smart, right? That can be used. We at RTS, we don't represent any product or service backend that we're trying to sell. So that's another important thing to look at. If you're talking to traditional automation companies or traditional industry companies, they're usually coming in the door with a product, and they're looking for a way to digitally transform your company with their product.
So being agnostic is actually a benefit.
It really is, because whereas a lot of times, a lot of these products have a lot of great uses, right? They're not. It's not that the technology is not good. It's that the strategy is wrong. So companies that don't have a strategy, that don't have the infrastructure and architecture, and have the minimum technical standards. If you don't have those three things, you shouldn't be doing anything, right, around digital transformation before you develop them. So that's the goal of the assessment, is to set the baseline. Do you have a strategy? Do you have the infrastructure and architecture? And do you have technical standards to meet what you're looking to do? And if you don't have those three things, then we have to help you do that.
Okay.
When you do a digital transformation maturity assessment, one of the first things you want to look for is so first, let's remember the goals. You got to have a strategy. And that strategy, you got to put that together first. What is it that you're wanting to accomplish, right? What is your drive? Second is the infrastructure and architecture to be able to support that strategy. And third is the technical standards to support that strategy, right? Because we don't just want to buy anything or invest in anything that goes into the ecosystem. Part of that is understanding culture. Part of that is understanding the people who are embracing the technology that you already have in place and are looking, right? You want to identify those people. You want to identify the people who are blockers. You want to understand that from an outsider's point of view, because it has nothing to do with it has to do with your strategy, right? You're trying to look for people who can embrace the strategy, and you want to be able to provide people with upward mobility, right? You want to be able to provide training and increase their capability in work. So that's the first thing, right? So how we do that is it's a series of workshops. We sit down, we've got a series of questions, and we take those questions and we ask it across the different segments and the different towers or departments of the organization to understand how they see their role in supporting the business. And if they don't have a strategy, then we help them develop a strategy. So if you don't have a strategy, we'll help you develop your strategy. The next step is we look at your infrastructure and your architecture and identify what you maybe have already purchased. Like, what is your ERP platform? What is your business platform? Do you have an MES? Do you have warehouse management? What is it? And what are its capabilities, right? We want to understand that. So we look for the things that you already have that are smart. And then we also look at the infrastructure and the architecture and understand, at the network level, at the security level, right? We want to look at the security stack on the enterprise side and the manufacturing and OT side. It's super important to understand how that works together. I've run into many companies that just we have an air gap between manufacturing and IT, or manufacturing and the enterprise. There is no data transfer between it. The company that I remember working with, they would literally take a USB drive to a server and plug in, and I'm like, that's one of the most insecure things I've ever seen.
Yeah.
But that was safety to them because they were really wanting to be sure that, or perceived certainty that there was not going to be any issues. But the answer is security in depth, right? It's not just perimeter security like that. So we look at that and make recommendations there. And then what really everybody wants is they want the data and the analytics, right? They want a quote that I learned at my time in automation. One of my managers told me, he says, we're in the business to provide the right information to the right person at the right time, in the right context, so they can act. Right? Actionable information. And I think that's aged well over the years, right? It seems like in IT and in OT, we're always in that state of trying to get access to actionable information. And so, the idea is, once you have the strategy and the architecture and the software to support that architecture in place, then you have the platform on which you can start building your transformation. Right? You start looking at, one of my favorite things is looking at large, complicated Excel spreadsheets that someone in the organization is building, and then using that platform to then automate that. Right? Now that data is accessible in real time. And then you go do the next one, and then you go do the next one. And what you find out is when you have that data in real time available, and then you can start experimenting. That's a bad word sometimes in enterprise. You start experimenting with that data and start doing predictive analytics or anomaly detection on, inventory counts or production yields, or even just using machine learning algorithms to do clustering on scheduling, for people to come in and take shifts. There's so many things that you can start experimenting with and looking for that then leads to the next thing, right? And that's part of the getting the flywheel going.
A lot of great information so far. So to end this segment, how long does a digital maturity assessment take?
Depending on the size of the organization, we don't want to, one of the main things is we don't want to put a burden on the organization. There's a certain level of investment that we need from the people and the teams. So you're really looking at, depending on size and complexity, 4 to 12 weeks.
Okay.
Right. Small organizations, 4 to 6 weeks. Bigger organizations, 8 to 12 weeks.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, Michael. This was
You're welcome.
really informative, and we'll be back next week with Cloud Myths.